Long before his name became a symbol of victory, mercy, and the struggle for Jerusalem, Saladin was simply a boy named Yusuf. He was born far from the city that would define his life, in the fortress town of Tikrit, on the banks of the Tigris River, in the year 1137 or 1138. The exact date has been lost, as so many details from the medieval world have been lost, but the setting remains clear. Tikrit stood above a wide and ancient river, on a route traveled by soldiers, merchants, pilgrims, and messengers. Dust rose from the roads. Boats moved slowly along the water. Beyond the walls, the plains of Mesopotamia stretched toward distant horizons. Yusuf's family was Kurdish. His father, Najm al-Din Ayyub, was a soldier and administrator. His uncle, Shirkuh, was a warrior of fierce energy and great ambition. The family belonged to a world in which loyalty could bring power, but a single mistake could bring exile. According to later accounts, Yusuf was born on the same night that his family was forced to leave Tikrit. Whether every detail of that story is exact cannot be known, yet it became an appropriate beginning for a life shaped by movement. The child who left one fortress in darkness would one day rule from Egypt to Syria and change the fate of Jerusalem. The family traveled north to Mosul, where they entered the service of Imad al-Din Zengi, one of the most powerful Muslim rulers of the age. Zengi was a hard and determined commander. His territories lay across northern Mesopotamia and Syria, and his ambitions brought him into conflict with rival Muslim princes, as well as the Christian states established by the First Crusade. Those Christian states had existed in the eastern Mediterranean for several decades by the time Yusuf was born. In 1099, armies from Western Europe had captured Jerusalem after a long and violent journey. They created new kingdoms and principalities along the coast and inland hills. The Kingdom of Jerusalem became the most famous. Farther north stood the county of Tripoli, the Principality of Antioch, and the county of Edessa. But the region was not divided into two simple camps. The political world of the 12th century was far more complicated. Muslim rulers fought other Muslim rulers. Christian rulers fought other Christian rulers. Alliances sometimes crossed religious boundaries. A prince could be an enemy one year and a negotiating partner the next. Local Christians, Muslims, Jews, Armenians, Greeks, Syrians, Kurds, Arabs, Turks, and Franks lived within a landscape of trade, pilgrimage, taxation, rivalry, and war. This was the world into which Yusuf grew. His father eventually received an important post in Baalbek, an old city in the hills of present-day Lebanon. Later, the family moved into the orbit of Damascus. For the young Yusuf, Damascus became the city of memory and affection. It was a place of gardens, fountains, markets, schools, mosques, workshops, and shaded courtyards. Water flowed through channels fed by the Barada River. Fruit trees grew beyond the walls. Caravans arrived with cloth, spices, metalwork, books, and news from distant lands. Damascus had been ancient before Rome was born. It had passed through the hands of empires, caliphs, generals, and dynasties. Its streets carried the voices of many peoples. A young nobleman could study law, religion, poetry, mathematics, horses, genealogy, and the art of government. Yusuf appears to have preferred study and religious learning to the life of a warrior. Later writers described him as thoughtful, serious, and more comfortable with scholars than with the rough excitement of military camps. There is no clear sign that anyone expected him to become a conqueror. His uncle Shirkuh was the obvious soldier of the family. Broad, forceful, and fearless, Shirkuh belonged naturally to the world of campaigns. Yusuf, by contrast, entered that world gradually. He learned to ride, to hunt, and to understand the organization of armies. But his early life was not shaped by a single dream of conquest. He grew into responsibility because events around him demanded it. In 1146, Zengi was assassinated. His dominions were divided, and his son Nur al-Din became ruler of Aleppo. Nur al-Din would become one of the most important figures in Yusuf's life. He was disciplined, politically skilled, and deeply committed to the idea of uniting Muslim territories against the Crusader states. He presented his rule as a moral mission as well as a political one. He built schools, supported religious scholars, strengthened cities, and gradually expanded his authority. Yusuf's father and uncle served Nur al-Din. Through them, Yusuf entered a network of command that stretched across Syria. He watched how power was created not only by victory in battle, but also by patience. A city might be won through negotiation. A rival might be weakened through marriage alliances or promises. A fortress might matter more than a field. A ruler needed soldiers, but he also needed judges, secretaries, tax officials, merchants, and men who could persuade others to accept his leadership. These lessons would remain with Yusuf for the rest of his life. The first great turning point came not in Jerusalem, but in Egypt. In the middle of the 12th century, Egypt was ruled by the Fatimid dynasty. The Fatimids followed Ismaili Sharia Islam, while Nur al-Din and most of his supporters were Sunni. But religion was only one part of the struggle. Egypt was wealthy. The Nile supported vast agriculture. Cairo and Fustat were centers of trade, administration, and learning. Whoever controlled Egypt possessed grain, taxes, ports, ships, and a strategic position between North Africa, the Red Sea, and the Eastern Mediterranean. Yet the Fatimid government had become unstable. Powerful ministers competed for control. The caliph remained a sacred figure, but real authority often belonged to whoever held the office of vizier. Palace factions rose and fell. Assassination and betrayal were never far away. At the same time, the rulers of the Kingdom of Jerusalem understood Egypt's value. King Amalric of Jerusalem launched repeated campaigns toward the Nile. If the Crusader kingdom gained Egypt, it would possess new wealth and could surround Nur al-Din's Syria from the south. Nur al-Din could not allow that. In 1164, he sent Shirkuh into Egypt with an army. Yusuf went with his uncle. He was still a young man, probably in his 20s, and later accounts suggest that he did not eagerly seek the assignment. Perhaps he understood the danger. The expedition would cross deserts, move through hostile territory, and enter a land of shifting alliances where yesterday's friend could become tomorrow's enemy. The army rode south from Syria. Horses and camels carried water, weapons, grain, tents, and equipment. The road passed through dry country where every spring and well mattered. Scouts moved ahead. Messengers traveled between commanders. At night, the camp settled beneath a sky filled with stars. Egypt must have seemed like another world when they reached it. The Nile cut a green path through the desert. Villages stood among fields of wheat, flax, and sugarcane. Date palms lined the water. Boats with broad sails moved against the current. Beyond the river's fertile banks, the land turned suddenly to sand. Shirkuh entered the struggle as an ally of Shawar, a former Fatimid vizier who wanted to regain power. With Syrian assistance, Shawar returned to office. But once restored, he feared Shirkuh's presence and turned against him. He sought help from King Amalric. Soon, the Syrian expedition found itself facing both Egyptian and Crusader forces. The campaign became a lesson in uncertainty. Cities changed hands. Agreements were made and abandoned. Armies marched and withdrew. Shirkuh held his ground at Bilbays for a time, but the expedition eventually returned to Syria. Nothing had been settled. A second expedition followed in 1167. Again, Yusuf accompanied his uncle. This time, the struggle moved deeper into Egypt. Shirkuh's army crossed the Nile and faced the forces of Amalric and Shawar near Al-Babian. The Syrians were outnumbered, but Shirkuh used movement and deception. He placed Yusuf in command of the center, knowing that the enemy would expect Shirkuh himself to be there. When the opposing forces attacked, the center withdrew in an organized manner, drawing the enemy away while Shirkuh struck elsewhere. The battle did not decide the fate of Egypt, but Yusuf had now commanded men under pressure. He had seen how discipline could defeat greater numbers. He had also seen the cost. Medieval battles were not clean movements on a map. They were confusion, dust, fear, heat, wounded horses, broken equipment, and men trying to hear commands above the noise. Afterward, Shirkuh moved to Alexandria, where he was welcomed by some of the population. He left Yusuf to help defend the city while he moved elsewhere. Alexandria stood on the Mediterranean, a place of sea winds, old monuments, crowded harbors, and memories reaching back to the age of the Ptolemies. Now it became a trap. Amalric and the Egyptians surrounded it. For months, Yusuf endured the siege. Food became scarce. The defenders watched the enemy lines. Every rumor mattered. Every messenger carried hope or danger. Eventually, Negotiations ended the crisis. The Syrians agreed to leave Egypt, and the Crusaders also withdrew. Yusuf returned to Syria with more experience than he had possessed before. Yet Egypt remained unstable, and King Amalric had not abandoned his ambitions. In 1168, Crusader forces invaded again. They attacked Bilbais and advanced toward Cairo. The Fatimid government, desperate for help, appealed once more to Nur al-Din. Shirkuh received command of a third expedition. Yusuf reportedly resisted going. Perhaps he was tired of Egyptian intrigues. Perhaps he feared another siege. Perhaps he simply understood that survival had depended on luck as much as skill. But his family and his ruler expected him to serve. So he rode south again. This time, events moved quickly. The Fatimid vizier Shawar, who had changed alliances more than once, was arrested and killed. Shirkuh became vizier of Egypt in early 1169. For the first time, Nur al-Din's commander stood at the center of Egyptian power. Then, only a few months later, Shirkuh died. His death created a vacuum. The Fatimid court needed a new vizier. Powerful men looked at one another with suspicion. Older commanders possessed experience, followers, and ambition. Yet the choice fell upon Yusuf. He was about 31 years old. The quiet young man from Tikrit, who had not sought command in Egypt, suddenly became one of the most powerful officials in the richest land of the eastern Mediterranean. From this moment, the world would know him by the honorific Salah al-Din, meaning the righteousness or goodness of the faith. In the West, the name would become Saladin. But his rise was not secure. He served a Fatimid caliph while owing loyalty to Nur al-Din. He commanded Syrian troops in a country with its own armies, officials, and religious traditions. Court factions might remove him. Rival commanders might rebel. The Crusader kingdom remained close. And far to the north, Nur al-Din watched carefully. Saladin had gained Egypt. Now he had to survive it. The position of vizier looked powerful from a distance, but in Cairo power rested on uncertain ground. The Fatimid Caliph al-Adid still occupied the palace. The old court maintained ceremonies, traditions, and networks of influence that had developed over 2 centuries. Soldiers from different backgrounds competed for pay and privilege. Some units were loyal to the Fatimid system. Others followed Syrian commanders. Officials guarded their positions. Families that had grown wealthy under the old order had no reason to welcome a young foreign vizier. Saladin moved carefully. He began by bringing trusted relatives and supporters into Egypt. His father, Ayyubid, eventually joined him. His brothers received commands. Loyal administrators were placed in important offices. This was not unusual in the medieval world. A ruler without a reliable family network could quickly become isolated. Saladin's rise would create the Ayyubid dynasty, named for his father, but in these early years the future of that dynasty was far from certain. He also worked to strengthen the army. Troops needed regular payment. Fortifications needed repair. Ships had to be built and supplied. Egypt's defenses could not depend on scattered forces that distrusted one another. Saladin gradually replaced parts of the older military structure with men tied more closely to him and to the Syrian ruling tradition. Resistance followed. In 1169, a serious uprising broke out among parts of the Fatimid army, especially units that feared losing their position. Fighting spread through Cairo. Streets and neighborhoods became battlegrounds. Saladin's forces eventually defeated the rebels, and the old military balance was broken. This was not a peaceful transformation. Medieval rule often rested on force, and Saladin could be severe when he believed his authority was threatened. The image later generations created of a ruler defined only by mercy is incomplete. He could negotiate generously, but he could also punish enemies, order executions, and destroy opposition. His world did not allow rulers to survive by kindness alone. Yet Saladin understood that fear could not govern Egypt by itself. He supported Sunni religious institutions, founded or restored schools, and brought scholars and judges into public life. Cairo had long been a center of Fatimid culture and Ismaili learning. Saladin did not erase its people or its daily life, but he redirected the state's religious support. Sunni teaching expanded. Public worship increasingly reflected the authority of the Abbasid Caliph in Baghdad rather than the Fatimid Caliph in Cairo. The change reached its final stage in 1171. By then, al-Adid was seriously ill. Saladin ordered that the Friday sermon, one of the great public signs of political legitimacy in the Islamic world, be delivered in the name of the Abbasid Caliph. The Fatimid Caliphate, founded in North Africa in the 10th century and established in Egypt since 969, came to an end. Al-Adid died soon afterward. There was no dramatic public battle at the palace gates. An entire dynasty disappeared through a change in prayer, administration, and allegiance. The green banners and ceremonies of the Fatimid state gave way to a new order. Egypt was now formally returned to the Sunni political world. Saladin remained, at least in theory, the servant of Nur al-Din. But theory and reality were beginning to separate. Nur al-Din ruled from Syria. Saladin controlled Egypt's treasury, army, and government. Messages traveled between them, filled with expressions of loyalty, instructions, concerns, and suspicion. Nur al-Din expected Egypt's resources to serve his wider struggle. Saladin sent money and gifts, but he also strengthened his own family's position. The relationship between the two men has often been described as a simple rivalry, but it was more delicate than that. Saladin owed much of his rise to Nur al-Din. He respected his ruler's reputation and understood the danger of open defiance. At the same time, he could not govern Egypt as a temporary officer forever. Every decision he made created interests tied to his own leadership. Egypt demanded constant attention. The Crusader states remained a threat from the northeast. Byzantine ships could appear in the Mediterranean. Bedouin tribes controlled important desert routes. Nubian forces threatened from the south. Across the Red Sea, the holy cities of Mecca and Medina depended on trade and political protection. Yemen offered access to routes leading toward the Indian Ocean. Saladin's family extended its reach. His brother Turan Shah campaigned in Nubia and later crossed to Yemen, where Ayyubid authority was established. These campaigns secured important ports and trade connections, though control was never simple or complete. The Ayyubids were becoming more than governors of Egypt. They were creating a regional power. Within Egypt, Saladin also faced the practical duties of rule. The Nile flood determined harvests. Taxation had to be collected without destroying the villages that produced the state's wealth. Grain moved towards cities and garrisons. Markets required regulation. Roads and canals needed protection. Pilgrims crossed the desert. Merchants expected contracts to be enforced. The grand story of kings and battles rested on countless ordinary tasks. In Cairo, scribes bent over documents. Accountants recorded payments. Judges heard disputes. Artisans hammered metal and carved wood. Bakers rose before dawn. Water carriers walked through narrow streets. Sailors loaded cargo on the Nile. In the countryside, farmers watched the river rise and fall, knowing that too little water meant hunger and too much could bring destruction. Saladin's court moved within this living world. He was not yet the legendary figure of later stories. He was a busy ruler managing petitions, receiving envoys, consulting commanders, and sending instructions. Contemporary admirers described him as accessible and patient. Petitioners might approach him directly. Scholars were welcomed. He listened to poetry and religious recitation. He valued conversation with learned men. He also became known for generosity. Money passed quickly through his hands. He rewarded soldiers, guests, relatives, scholars, and messengers. This generosity strengthened loyalty and enhanced his reputation, but it could also create financial strain. Saladin was not a ruler who built a great private treasure and guarded it carefully. At his death, later writers emphasized how little personal wealth remained. But generosity did not remove the burdens of leadership. In 1170 and 1171, Saladin conducted operations against Crusader positions near Egypt. He attacked Gaza and other places, testing the frontier. He strengthened the route between Cairo and Syria. The fortress of Ayla, near the head of the Gulf of Aqaba, was captured, helping secure travel toward the Red Sea. Still, Saladin hesitated to join every campaign Nur al-Din proposed. On one occasion, he withdrew from a planned joint operation, reportedly because he feared what might happen if he met Nur al-Din in person. His father advised caution. The family understood that their growing power could appear disloyal. Then Saladin's father died in 1173 after a riding accident. The loss was personal and political. Ayyub had been more than a parent. He was a counselor, mediator, and respected elder who could speak to both his son and Nur al-Din. Without him, the delicate relationship became harder to manage. Nur al-Din began preparing to move toward Egypt. It is impossible to know exactly what would have happened if the two men had confronted one another. Perhaps Saladin would have submitted. Perhaps the Ayyubid family would have fought. Perhaps a compromise would have preserved the larger alliance. The confrontation never came. In May 1174, Nur al-Din died in Damascus. He left behind a young son, al-Salih Ismail, an estate filled with ambitious commanders. The unity Nur al-Din had built began to fracture almost immediately. Aleppo, Mosul, Damascus, and other centers looked toward different leaders. Some officials claimed to protect the young heir. Others sought territory for themselves. Saladin now faced a choice. He could remain in Egypt and allow Syria to divide. That would leave Crusader states between rival Muslim powers and might expose Egypt once again. Or he could move north and present himself as the defender of Nur al-Din's legacy. He chose to move. In late 1174, Saladin crossed the desert toward Damascus. He did not come as an open enemy of Nur al-Din's son. His public language emphasized service, protection, and unity. He claimed that he was preserving the state until the young heir could rule properly. Damascus opened its gates to him. The city where Yusuf had spent much of his youth now welcomed him as master. He entered not as a student or junior officer, but as ruler of Egypt and guardian of Syria. Yet Aleppo resisted. The officials around al-Salih Ismail viewed Saladin as a usurper. They appealed to neighboring rulers and sought support against him. The old political map had not disappeared simply because Saladin spoke of unity. Campaigns followed across Syria. Saladin captured Hama and moved toward Homs. He defeated a coalition of rivals near the Horns of Hama in 1175. After this victory, he increasingly used the title of Sultan and gained recognition from the Abbasid Caliph. His authority was no longer based only on his Egyptian office or his service to Nur al-Din. It had become a state in its own right. But Aleppo remained beyond his control, and another danger moved in the shadows. The Nizari Ismailis, known in Western sources as the Assassins, held mountain fortresses in Syria. Their leaders used carefully planned killings as a political weapon. They did not possess armies large enough to defeat Saladin in open battle, but they could reach commanders inside guarded camps. At least 2 attempts were made on Saladin's life during his Syrian campaigns. In one attack, an assassin came close enough to strike him. Armor and the intervention of guards saved him. The experience left a deep impression. Afterward, Saladin increased security around his camp. Guards inspected the ground. Lamps burned at night. Strangers could not approach easily. Imagine the silence after such an attack. A ruler sits inside a tent, listening to movements beyond the fabric walls. Every footstep may belong to a servant, a soldier, or a killer. Victory in battle offers no protection from a blade carried by one determined man. Saladin later campaigned near the Ismaili fortress of Masyaf, but he did not destroy their power. A settlement was reached. The exact details are uncertain, and later storytellers added legends. What matters is that Saladin understood when negotiations served him better than endless war. This balance between force and compromise became one of the central features of his rule. He wanted unity, but unity had to be constructed city by city, family by family, and treaty by treaty. Some places surrendered. Some received favorable terms. Some resisted. Some rulers became relatives through marriage. Others kept local authority in exchange for recognizing Saladin's leadership. The process would take years. And while Saladin worked to unite Egypt and Syria, the Kingdom of Jerusalem watched him grow stronger. Across the frontier, the Kingdom of Jerusalem was entering a difficult age. Its king was Baldwin IV, a young man who had been diagnosed with leprosy. The illness would slowly weaken his body, but it did not immediately destroy his ability to rule. Baldwin was intelligent, determined, and capable of surprising his enemies. His kingdom contained experienced nobles, fortified cities, military orders, and a network of castles guarding roads and borders. Among the most powerful military orders were the Knights Templar and the Knights Hospitaller. Their members lived under religious vows, but they were also trained warriors. They maintained strongholds, protected pilgrims, and fielded disciplined cavalry. Their castles rose above roads, valleys, and river crossings. Thick walls, towers, cisterns, and storerooms allowed relatively small garrisons to hold strategic points for long periods. Saladin's growing state was larger and wealthier than the Kingdom of Jerusalem, but size alone did not guarantee victory. His territories were spread across great distances. Local rulers had their own interests. Armies could not remain in the field forever. Horses needed fodder. Soldiers expected payment. Harvest seasons shaped the movement of men. A campaign that began with confidence could end in exhaustion. In 1177, Saladin invaded the Kingdom of Jerusalem from Egypt. He believed the moment was favorable. Many Frankish forces were occupied elsewhere, and King Baldwin appeared vulnerable. Saladin's army crossed the frontier and moved through the southern lands of the kingdom. Some troops spread out to gather supplies and plunder. The march lost some of its discipline. Baldwin responded with remarkable speed. Though still young and already suffering from illness, he gathered a smaller force and advanced against Saladin. Near Montgassard, close to Ramla, the Crusader army struck unexpectedly. The result was a serious defeat for Saladin. His forces were scattered. Men fled across the countryside. Equipment was lost. The Sultan himself escaped with difficulty, returning toward Egypt through harsh conditions. Later accounts magnified the drama, but the essential fact remains. Saladin had underestimated his opponent, allowed his army to become dispersed, and paid a heavy price. For a ruler later remembered for great victories, Montgassard was an important lesson. It showed him that confidence could become carelessness. It reminded him that the Crusader cavalry, when concentrated and well led, remained dangerous. It also revealed the limits of an army operating far from secure water and supply lines. Saladin did not collapse after the defeat. He rebuilt. He restored discipline, gathered resources, and waited for another opportunity. The frontier returned to its rhythm of raids, truces, negotiations, and sudden violence. Neither side could maintain constant war. Merchants still crossed borders. Farmers still worked fields near contested lands. Prisoners were exchanged. Envoys traveled under safe conduct. In 1179, Saladin gained revenge at the Battle of Marjayan, where Crusader forces were defeated and several important men were captured. Soon afterward, he turned his attention toward a new fortress being built by the Templars at Jacob's Ford on the upper Jordan River. The site was strategically important. A strong Crusader castle there could threaten the route between Damascus and northern Palestine. Baldwin had begun construction despite Saladin's objections. Stone walls rose near the river, and laborers worked to complete the defenses. Saladin first attempted negotiation. He reportedly offered money if the castle were abandoned. When the offer failed, he prepared an assault. In August 1179, his army surrounded Jacob's Ford. Siege warfare demanded patience and specialized skill. Miners dug beneath walls. Archers tried to drive defenders from the battlements. Engineers prepared machines. Soldiers filled ditches and protected workers. Inside the fortress, the garrison waited for relief. Saladin's men broke through before Baldwin could arrive. The fortress fell. Many defenders were killed or captured. The walls were destroyed so they could not be used again. The victory secured the rout and proved that Saladin could overcome a newly built Crusader stronghold. But the struggle for the region was still far from its decisive moment. During these years, Saladin continued the slower work of unifying Muslim territories. Aleppo remained a central prize. The city was wealthy, fortified, and symbolically important. It had been Nur al-Din's capital and stood near the frontier with Antioch. To control Aleppo was to claim a larger part of Nur al-Din's inheritance. Saladin could not simply storm every city that resisted him. A destructive siege might weaken the very lands he hoped to unite. Instead, he combined military pressure with negotiation. In 1183, after years of conflict and bargaining, Aleppo finally passed into his hands through an agreement. He exchanged other territories and recognized certain rights of its former ruler. When Saladin entered Aleppo, his state linked Egypt more securely with much of Syria. He later extended his influence eastward toward Mosul. The rulers there resisted direct conquest, and Saladin never fully absorbed every region he desired. Yet by 1186, agreements recognized his supremacy across a broad zone. His authority stretched from the Nile Valley through Damascus and Aleppo into parts of northern Mesopotamia and beyond. This did not mean that he ruled a perfectly centralized empire. Ayyubid power was shared among family members and local governors. Saladin assigned cities and regions to brothers, sons, nephews, and trusted commanders. They collected revenues, maintained troops, and administered local affairs. The Sultan stood above them, but their loyalty depended on family bonds, shared interests, personal respect, and the expectation of reward. This structure gave the dynasty flexibility. A local ruler could react quickly to threats, but it also contained future weakness. After Saladin's death, his relatives would compete over the inheritance he had created. For now, however, the system served him. He moved frequently between Cairo, Damascus, Aleppo, and military camps. Medieval rulers often governed while traveling. The court followed with secretaries, judges, guards, servants, horses, tents, records, gifts, and supplies. Orders were written and sealed. Couriers rode ahead. Local officials prepared food and lodging. A journey from Egypt to Syria was never a small matter. The route crossed the Sinai and the dry lands beyond. Water had to be planned carefully. A single broken well could endanger hundreds of men and animals. Sand entered clothing and equipment. Daylight brought heat. Nights could be cold. Saladin knew these roads intimately. He also knew the cities at either end. Cairo offered the immense resources of the Nile. Damascus offered access to the Syrian interior and remained close to his heart. The two capitals formed the foundation of his power. As his state grew stronger, Saladin increasingly presented the recovery of Jerusalem as its great purpose. Jerusalem held profound meaning for Muslims, Christians, and Jews. For Muslims, it was Al-Quds, the holy city, home to the sanctuary known as Al-Haram al-Sharif, with the Dome of the Rock and the Al-Aqsa Mosque. Islamic tradition connected it with prophets and with the Prophet Muhammad's night journey. For Christians, it contained the Church of the Holy Sepulchre and the places associated with the final days, crucifixion, and resurrection of Jesus. For Jews, it was the city of the ancient temple and the center of sacred memory. The city's meaning made it more than a military objective. Yet Saladin could not capture Jerusalem through speeches or symbols. He first had to weaken the kingdom that protected it. That required unity, money, discipline, and a favorable political moment. The kingdom of Jerusalem, meanwhile, was struggling with succession. Baldwin IV's illness worsened. His hands and face were affected. Riding became harder. He was carried at times, yet continued to direct government and war. Because he could not expect to produce an heir, the marriages of his sisters became matters of survival for the kingdom. One sister, Sibylla, married Guy of Lusignan, a nobleman from western France. Guy's rise divided the barons. Some accepted him. Others doubted his judgment. Raymond III of Tripoli, one of the most experienced nobles in the kingdom, became a rival center of influence. The court's divisions deepened as Baldwin's health declined. A child, Baldwin V, was crowned as co-king in an attempt to secure succession. But the boy died in 1186, shortly after Baldwin IV had also died. Sibylla then claimed the crown and placed it on Guy's head. Guy of Lusignan was now king of Jerusalem. The kingdom he inherited was politically divided and surrounded by a ruler who had spent years uniting Egypt and Syria. One man made the danger even greater. His name was Reynold of Chatillon. Reynold had arrived in the eastern Mediterranean decades earlier. He had been Prince of Antioch, had spent many years as a prisoner in Aleppo, and later became lord of the great fortress of Kerak in Transjordan. Kerak stood above routes connecting Syria, Arabia, and Egypt. From his castles, Reynold could threaten caravans and pilgrims. He was bold, unpredictable, and often ruthless. At times when truces existed between Saladin and the Kingdom of Jerusalem, Reynold attacked Muslim caravans. He also launched an extraordinary expedition toward the Red Sea, sending ships that threatened ports and routes near the holy cities. Saladin's forces eventually destroyed the expedition, but the insult was remembered. According to Muslim sources, Saladin vowed that he would personally kill Reynold if he ever captured him. In 1186 or early 1187, Reynold attacked another large caravan traveling between Cairo and Damascus. Goods were seized, and people were taken prisoner. Saladin demanded their release. King Guy appears to have ordered Reynold to make restitution, but Reynold refused. The truce was breaking. Saladin now had what he needed: a united claim of grievance, a stronger army, and an opponent weakened by internal division. Across Egypt, Syria, and the neighboring regions, orders went out. Commanders gathered troops. Horsemen prepared bows, swords, shields, armor, and saddles. Storehouses opened. Grain was measured. Animals were collected. Religious leaders spoke of Jerusalem. Volunteers joined professional soldiers. Banners were raised. The armies began to move toward the Jordan. The campaign of 1187 was about to begin. In the spring and early summer of 1187, Saladin assembled the largest coalition he had yet commanded. Contingents arrived from Egypt, Damascus, Aleppo, the Jazira, and other regions. Some were professional cavalrymen supported by land revenues. Some were tribal horsemen. Some were volunteers drawn by the call to recover Jerusalem. The army included archers, spearmen, engineers, servants, merchants, animal handlers, and men responsible for moving food and water. No medieval source can give a completely reliable number. Chroniclers often enlarged armies to make events appear more magnificent. What is certain is that Saladin brought together a powerful force and coordinated it with care. He crossed the Jordan and established himself in the region east of the Sea of Galilee. The summer heat grew stronger. The land was dry. Hills rose above valleys where water could be found only at certain springs and streams. Water would become the silent weapon of the campaign. Before the main battle, Saladin sent forces toward Tiberias, a fortified town on the western shore of the Sea of Galilee. Tiberias belonged to Raymond of Tripoli through his wife, Esquiva, who was inside the citadel. The town was attacked and taken, though the citadel continued to resist. News reached the Crusader army gathered at the springs of Sephoria or Sephuria. The position at Sephoria was strong. The army had water. The ground favored defense. If the Franks remained there, Saladin would have difficulty forcing a decisive battle. His troops could not wait forever in hostile territory, especially in summer. The leaders of the Kingdom of Jerusalem met in council. Raymond of Tripoli faced a painful choice. His wife was in the citadel at Tiberias. His lands were under attack, yet he reportedly urged the king not to march. He understood that Saladin wanted them to leave the water. Tiberias might be lost, he argued, but the kingdom's field army must be preserved. At first, King Guy accepted this advice. Then the decision changed. During the night, Gerard de Ridefort, master of the Templars and an enemy of Raymond, pressed the king to advance. To remain still, he suggested, would appear cowardly. The army had gathered to fight. Tiberias was threatened. Honor, politics, and rivalry all entered the discussion. By morning, Guy ordered the march. It was one of the most consequential decisions in the history of the Crusader states. On July 3rd, the army left the springs of Sephoria and moved east toward Tiberias. The distance was not enormous, but the conditions were punishing. Thousands of men, horses, and pack animals followed narrow routes through dry country. Heavy cavalry wore mail and carried shields. Infantry struggled to maintain formation. Dust rose beneath their feet. The sun stood high above the hills. Saladin's mounted archers closed around them. They did not need to destroy the army immediately. They needed to slow it, tire it, and keep it away from water. Horse archers approached, released arrows, and withdrew before the Frankish knights could force a full engagement. The Crusader columns compressed and separated. Messages became harder to deliver. The Franks hoped to reach springs near the village of Hattin or perhaps the Sea of Galilee beyond. But progress was slow. By the afternoon, thirst had become a serious danger. Raymond and the advance guard pushed toward water, but the main army could not keep pace. King Guy eventually ordered a halt near the twin hills known as the Horns of Hattin, the remains of an ancient volcanic formation rising above the plain. The decision meant that the army would spend the night without secure water. Saladin's forces surrounded them. As darkness fell, the Crusaders could see the lights of the Muslim camps across the hills. They could hear drums, voices, horses, and the movement of troops. Some accounts describe the Muslims bringing water in abundance, pouring it out or drinking within sight of the thirsty enemy. Whether every scene happened exactly as later writers described it, the psychological contrast was real. One army had access to supplies. The other was trapped. The night must have felt endless. Men lay awake beneath the open sky. Armor pressed against tired bodies. Horses breathed heavily. The wounded asked for water that could not be given. Officers argued over what to do at dawn. Saladin also remained awake, overseeing positions and preparing for the final attack. This was the opportunity he had spent years creating. If he failed, the Crusaders might break through. If he succeeded, the field army of the Kingdom of Jerusalem could be destroyed in a single day. On the morning of July 4th, the battle resumed. Saladin's troops set fire to dry grass and brush. Smoke drifted toward the Crusader positions, adding heat and confusion. Muslim archers continued to shoot. The Frankish infantry tried to protect the cavalry, but thirst and pressure broke their formations. Raymond of Tripoli led a charge, attempting to escape or open a path. Saladin's men allowed the force through and then closed the gap. Raymond and a small number of others escaped, but they could not return to the main army. The Crusader center moved toward the horns of Hattin. The relic known as the True Cross had been carried with the army. For the kingdom, it was a sacred object and a symbol of divine protection. Clergy held it above the soldiers as the battle tightened around them. Frankish knights launched repeated charges. A massed cavalry charge could be terrifying, even to experienced troops. Saladin's son Al-Afthal, who witnessed the battle as a young man, later remembered believing that victory had been won each time the enemy seemed to retreat. But Saladin understood that the battle was not finished. He urged his men to hold until the Crusader formation completely collapsed. The knights returned again and again to the hill around King Guy's red tent. Each charge became weaker. Horses fell. Men abandoned armor. Infantrymen tried to reach the lake. Some were cut down. Others surrendered. The True Cross was captured. At last, the royal tent fell. King Guy of Jerusalem was taken prisoner. So were many of the kingdom's leading nobles and knights. Reynold of Chatillon was among them. The military orders suffered devastating losses. The army that had defended the Kingdom of Jerusalem was no longer an effective force. After the battle, the most famous encounter took place inside Saladin's tent. King Guy and Reynold were brought before him. Guy was exhausted and thirsty. Saladin offered him a cup of chilled or cooled water. Guy drank and then passed the cup to Reynold. In the customs of the time, offering a prisoner food or drink could imply protection. Saladin made clear that he had not personally offered hospitality to Reynold. He confronted Reynold over broken truces and attacks on caravans. Accounts differ in details, but Saladin then struck him, and Reynold was killed by the Sultan or by guards at his order. King Guy feared that he would be next. Saladin reassured him. Kings, he said in one version of the story, did not usually kill kings. Reynold had been punished for his own actions. Guy remained a prisoner, but survived. The fate of captured Templars and Hospitallers was harsher. Many were executed after the battle. Saladin and his advisors viewed the military orders as especially committed enemies who would return to war if ransomed. The episode stands as a reminder that Saladin's reputation for chivalry existed beside acts of calculated severity. Thousands of other prisoners were sold, exchanged, ransomed, or distributed. Chroniclers wrote that the markets became crowded with captives and that prices fell because there were so many. Their words reveal the brutal reality of medieval warfare. Victory for one side meant enslavement, displacement, or grief for another. Yet the most important result of Hattin was strategic. The Kingdom of Jerusalem had lost its main army. Its greatest relic had been captured. Many castles and cities still possessed walls, but few had enough trained soldiers to resist a determined siege. Saladin moved quickly. He did not remain at Hattin to celebrate for long. The roads were open, and every day mattered. Tiberias surrendered. Acre, the great port, opened its gates. Other coastal and inland cities followed. Nazareth, Nablus, Jaffa, Sidon, Beirut, and Ascalon came under his control in the weeks after the battle, though the exact order and terms varied. Some places resisted briefly. Others negotiated. Saladin often offered safe conduct or favorable conditions because speed mattered more than destruction. If a city surrendered without a long siege, his army could move to the next objective. The map changed with astonishing speed. Castles that had watched the roads for generations now saw new banners approaching. Messengers carried news from one town to another. Families packed what they could. Priests, merchants, craftsmen, and officials waited to learn whether they would be allowed to stay or required to leave. One important city did not fall. Tyre, on the Mediterranean coast, became the center of surviving resistance. Its defenses were strengthened by Conrad of Montferrat, a nobleman who had arrived at a crucial moment. Saladin attempted to take the city but failed. Tyre's walls, position, and determined defense preserved a foothold from which the Crusader recovery would later begin. For now, however, Saladin turned inland. Jerusalem remained in Christian hands. The city had lost many of its defenders at Hattin. Refugees poured through its gates, bringing stories of defeat. The population swelled. Food and money had to be organized. Fear spread through streets filled with holy places. Balian of Ibelin, one of the few major nobles to escape Hattin, entered Jerusalem under unusual circumstances. He had asked Saladin for permission to pass through the lines so he could collect his wife and family, promising not to bear arms and to remain only briefly. Once inside, the people and clergy begged him to lead the defense. Balian faced a conflict between his oath and the desperate needs of the city. He sent word to Saladin, explaining the situation. Saladin released him from the promise. He even allowed Balian's family to leave safely. It was a gesture of courtesy between enemies. But courtesy would not prevent the siege. By September 1187, Saladin's army approached Jerusalem. Jerusalem waited behind walls built and repaired by many generations. The city stood high in the hills, surrounded by valleys and dry slopes. Its gates opened toward roads leading to Bethlehem, Hebron, Jaffa, Damascus, and the Jordan. Inside were churches, monasteries, houses, markets, cisterns, and sacred spaces known across the world. The population was crowded and frightened. Refugees had arrived from towns captured after Hattin. Many had little money. Some had lost relatives. Few trained knights remained. Balian reportedly created new knights from the sons of noble families and organized every able defender he could find. The memory of 1099 haunted the city. When the First Crusade captured Jerusalem, the conquest had been followed by mass killing. Muslim and Jewish inhabitants died in large numbers. Nearly 90 years later, Christians inside the city feared that Saladin would answer violence with violence. Saladin first approached from the west, then shifted his camp to the north and east, where the ground offered better opportunities for attack. Engineers studied the walls. Siege engines were assembled. Archers and crossbowmen exchanged fire. Miners worked beneath fortifications while defenders tried to stop them. The sounds continued day and night. Stones struck masonry. Wood creaked. Hammers rang against metal. Prayers rose from both sides. Dust filled the air where walls were damaged. Inside the city, people carried water, moved supplies, cared for the injured, and watched the battlements. Saladin did not want to destroy Jerusalem if he could take it through surrender. The sacred character of the city mattered to him, and a long assault would cost lives and damage holy places. Yet he also needed a victory that would confirm the meaning of Hattin. Balian sought negotiations. At first, Saladin demanded unconditional surrender. Balian then warned that if the defenders believed death was certain, they might destroy sacred sites, kill prisoners, and fight until no one remained. The threat may have been part of negotiation, but it forced both sides to consider the consequences of a final assault. Terms were arranged. The city would surrender. Most inhabitants would be allowed to leave after paying a ransom. Men, women, and children were assigned different amounts. Those unable to pay risked enslavement, as was common under the laws and practices of the age. The arrangement was far more restrained than the capture of 1099, but it was not an uncomplicated act of universal mercy. Wealthy families could secure freedom more easily. Poor people gathered in fear, uncertain whether enough money could be found. Balian negotiated a collective payment for thousands of the poor. Saladin released others without payment. His brother Aladil asked for captives and then freed them. Members of the clergy and other leaders also arranged releases. Still, some people were enslaved because the ransom was not paid. History often turns difficult events into simple legends. Saladin's capture of Jerusalem was merciful by the standards of medieval conquest, especially when compared with 1099. But the experience of the conquered still included loss, exile, separation, and sorrow. On October 2nd, 1187, Jerusalem formally surrendered. The date corresponded with the anniversary, in the Islamic calendar, of the Prophet Muhammad's night journey as understood by many Muslims. For Saladin and his followers, the timing added sacred meaning to the victory. Muslim banners rose above the walls. The golden dome of the rock, visible across the city, returned to Muslim control. The cross that had been placed above it was removed. The Al-Aqsa Mosque, which the Crusaders had used in connection with the royal palace and the Templars, was cleansed and prepared for worship. Rosewater was used. Carpets and lamps were brought in. The pulpit commissioned years earlier by Nur al-Din for the hoped-for recovery of Jerusalem was eventually installed. Nur al-Din had not lived to see the city restored. Saladin, once his subordinate and later his political heir, completed the goal that had shaped both of their careers. The first Friday prayer after the conquest drew soldiers, scholars, officials, and worshippers. Sermons praised the victory and reminded listeners of duty. Men who had marched for months stood beneath the roof of Al-Aqsa. Some wept. Elsewhere in the city, Christian sacred sites were protected. The Church of the Holy Sepulchre was not destroyed. There was discussion about its future, but Saladin allowed it to remain. Eastern Christian communities, including Greek Orthodox and other local groups, continued to have access under new arrangements. Latin Christian inhabitants largely departed, though Christian pilgrimage later resumed. Jewish families were also permitted to return to Jerusalem after a long period of exclusion under Crusader rule. Communities from nearby regions and from farther away gradually re-established a presence in the city. For Saladin, possession of Jerusalem brought immense prestige. Poets celebrated him. Scholars wrote letters. News traveled across the Islamic world. The ruler who had once struggled to survive as vizier of Egypt was now the liberator of Al-Quds. But victory created new responsibilities. The city needed officials, guards, judges, caretakers, and revenue. Properties had to be assigned. Religious endowments required restoration. The holy places had to be maintained. The flow of pilgrims had to be managed. And beyond Jerusalem, the war had not ended. Several Crusader strongholds remained. Tyre was still unconquered. The castles of Kerak, Montreal, Belvoir, and others resisted. Antioch and Tripoli survived in the north. Saladin's army had campaigned for months and could not remain concentrated forever. He released King Guy in 1188 after receiving promises that the king would not resume war. Guy soon returned to the struggle, arguing that an oath given under captivity did not bind him. This decision would have enormous consequences. Saladin may later have regretted the release. The victory at Jerusalem also sent shock through Western Europe. Messengers carried the news by sea. Courts and churches heard that the holy city had fallen, the true cross had been captured, and the kingdom of Jerusalem was nearly destroyed. Pope Urban III died soon after receiving reports, though accounts connecting his death directly to the news may be more dramatic than certain. Calls for a new crusade spread. The response would become the Third Crusade. Three of the most powerful rulers of Europe took the cross: Frederick Barbarossa, Emperor of the Germans, Philip II of France, and Richard I of England, later called the Lionheart. The scale of the coming expedition was greater than anything Saladin had yet faced from Europe. Before those armies arrived, Saladin continued reducing isolated fortresses. Kerak, the stronghold once held by Raynald of Chatillon, finally surrendered after a long blockade. Montreal also fell. Belvoir resisted for months before accepting terms. Safed and other positions were taken. Each siege required men, machines, supplies, and negotiation. The process was slower than the rapid advances after Hattin. Castles were designed to survive. Their cisterns stored water. Their walls stood on cliffs or ridges. Defenders could wait behind stone while an attacking army consumed food and money outside. Disease could weaken a camp. Winter rain could turn roads to mud. Summer heat exhausted animals. Saladin moved between fronts, trying to finish the conquest before the Western armies arrived. Tyre remained the greatest failure. Conrad of Montferrat organized its defense with energy. The city stood partly protected by the sea, with walls that were difficult to approach. Saladin's fleet and land forces could not force surrender. Naval fighting brought setbacks. Eventually, he withdrew. That single surviving port became a refuge for soldiers, nobles, and new arrivals from Europe. It preserved the political life of the Crusader kingdom. It also gave future expeditions a place to land. Meanwhile, King Guy sought to recover his position. Conrad refused to admit him into Tyre, questioning his authority after the disaster at Hattin. Guy gathered supporters and turned toward Acre, now held by Saladin's forces. In August 1189, with a relatively small army, Guy began to besiege the city. At first, the attempt seemed almost impossible. Acre had strong walls and access to the sea. Saladin's army arrived and surrounded the besiegers. The result was a strange double siege. Inside Acre, the Muslim garrison resisted Guy. Outside the Crusader camp, Saladin's forces tried to break through. The Crusaders were themselves trapped between the city walls and the Sultan's army. Yet ships continued to bring reinforcements, food, weapons, and pilgrims from Europe. Camps expanded along the coast. Ditches, wooden barriers, tents, workshops, chapels, ovens, and markets appeared. The siege would last nearly 2 years. It became one of the longest and most exhausting struggles of Saladin's life. Seasons changed around Acre. Summer dust gave way to winter rain. Mud covered the camps. Disease spread through crowded quarters. Food prices rose. Ships arrived and disappeared with the weather. Men died without ever seeing a great battle. Saladin maintained his camp outside the Crusader lines. He summoned troops from across his territories, but many contingents could serve only for limited periods. Emirs needed to return home. Horses required rest. The Sultan had to persuade, reward, and command a coalition that was never as permanent as the stone walls of Acre. He also faced personal strain. Contemporary accounts describe periods of illness. The burdens of constant campaigning were visible. Saladin rode between positions, received reports, wrote letters, inspected troops, and tried to coordinate attacks. At night, he listened to news from the city and the sea. The siege produced acts of courage, cruelty, negotiation, and exhaustion on both sides. There were attempts to send swimmers and divers through the water with messages. Ships tried to break blockades. Siege engines burned. Tunnels collapsed. Prisoners were exchanged. At times, soldiers from opposing camps met informally between battles, speaking, trading, or watching contests. War did not erase curiosity about the enemy, but the arrival of the great Western rulers would transform the siege once again. The first of the great monarchs to begin the journey east was Frederick Barbarossa. He was an old and experienced emperor, famous across Europe. His army traveled overland through the Byzantine Empire and Anatolia. The march was difficult, but the force remained formidable. News of its approach caused deep concern in Saladin's court. A large German army arriving in northern Syria might unite with the Crusader states and force Saladin to defend several fronts at once. Then, in June 1190, Frederick drowned while crossing the Salef River in southern Anatolia. The exact circumstances were confused. Perhaps he was thrown from his horse. Perhaps the current overwhelmed him. Whatever happened, the emperor's sudden death broke the strength of the expedition. Many soldiers turned home. Others continued under weakened leadership. A smaller remnant eventually reached the eastern Mediterranean, but the vast danger Saladin had feared never fully appeared. The sea brought the next rulers. Philip II of France reached Acre in the spring of 1191. Richard I of England arrived in June after a dramatic journey that included the conquest of Cyprus. Richard was in his early 30s, physically strong, experienced in war, and determined to prove himself. He had spent only a small part of his reign in England, but the wealth of his territories helped finance his crusade. The man remembered as Richard the Lionheart was not merely a reckless knight. He understood logistics, fortification, naval power, and the discipline required to move an army. He could inspire soldiers and calculate military risk. He was also proud, severe, and capable of violence that even his own age recognized as terrible. Richard and Saladin would become linked in legend. Later stories imagine them meeting face to face, sharing meals, testing swords, or exchanging noble compliments. In reality, they never met. Their relationship was conducted through envoys, messages, gifts, threats, and the actions of armies. Yet each learned to respect the other's ability. With the arrival of Philip and Richard, pressure on Acre increased. Massive siege engines struck the walls. Miners attacked foundations. Crossbowmen covered workers. Ships tightened control of the harbor. The defenders sent desperate messages to Saladin. The Sultan attempted repeated attacks on the outer Crusader lines, but could not break the siege. His army was close enough to see signals from the city, yet the walls and enemy camps stood between them. Inside Acre, food and hope ran low. On July 12, 1191, the garrison surrendered. The terms included payment of a large ransom, the return of Christian captives, and the restoration of the true cross if it could be produced. Thousands of Muslim soldiers and inhabitants became prisoners. The fall of Acre was a heavy defeat for Saladin. For nearly 2 years, he had tried to preserve the city. Now the Crusaders controlled a major port and possessed a secure base for further operations. Philip of France soon returned home, leaving Richard as the dominant military leader of the expedition. Negotiations began over the terms of surrender. Richard demanded payment and the release of captives according to the agreed schedule. Saladin faced difficulties assembling everything and questioned parts of the exchange. Each side suspected delay and bad faith. Weeks passed. On August 20th, Richard ordered the execution of the Muslim prisoners held outside Acre. Several thousand people were killed within sight of Saladin's army. Some may have been combatants, others servants or inhabitants. Medieval sources disagree over numbers and details. Saladin's troops tried to intervene but arrived too late. The massacre destroyed hopes of an immediate exchange. Saladin later ordered or permitted reprisals against some captured crusaders. The war entered a darker stage. The chivalric image attached to both leaders should never hide the suffering of prisoners who possessed no control over royal negotiations. Richard then prepared to march south along the coast toward Jaffa. The route was chosen carefully. By keeping the sea on his right, he could receive supplies from ships and protect one flank. Infantry marched in ordered formations. Crossbowmen and spearmen shielded the cavalry. The army moved slowly to preserve discipline in the heat. Saladin followed inland. His mounted archers harassed the column. They approached, released arrows, and withdrew. The Crusaders endured the pressure behind shields. Horses were struck. Men fell. Yet Richard refused to allow an uncontrolled charge. This was exactly the kind of patience Saladin himself had learned after Montcassard. For days, the two armies moved south through the coastal plain. The Mediterranean lay bright beside them. Inland, wooded hills and fields offered cover to Saladin's horsemen. Dust hung above the marching columns. On September 7th, near Arsuf, the pressure became a major battle. Saladin attacked the Crusader formation repeatedly. Drums sounded. Mounted archers rode close. Infantry skirmishers moved forward. Richard's men continued toward Arsuf, trying to maintain order. The Hospitallers at the rear came under intense attack. Their horses suffered, and their commanders asked permission to charge. Richard ordered them to wait. He wanted the cavalry attack to come at the right moment and as a single force. At last, whether by command or because the pressure had become unbearable, the Hospitallers charged. Other knights followed. The sudden counterattack struck Saladin's troops before they could fully withdraw. Richard committed the rest of his cavalry, turning a partial movement into a coordinated assault. The Muslim lines were driven back. Saladin's army did not disintegrate as the Crusader army had at Hattin. He rallied troops and prevented complete disaster. But Arsuf was a clear victory for Richard. It confirmed that his disciplined coastal march could resist Saladin's tactics. The Crusaders reached Jaffa and repaired its defenses. Jerusalem now seemed closer. But the road from Jaffa to the Holy City climbed through difficult inland country. Supply lines would stretch away from the fleet. Wells and roads could be controlled. Winter weather could make transport difficult. Even if the Crusaders reached Jerusalem, they might not be able to capture or hold it. Saladin understood this. He ordered Ascalon's fortifications dismantled rather than allow the city to become another Crusader base, threatening the road between Egypt and Syria. The work was painful for inhabitants who had to leave or watch walls torn down. But from the Sultan's perspective, the strategic connection to Egypt was too important to risk. Both leaders now faced limits. Richard could win battles, but he did not have endless men or time. Political rivalries waited in Europe. His brother John and King Philip threatened his territories. Saladin controlled the interior, but his army was tired and his authority depended on commanders whose enthusiasm weakened as campaigns dragged on. Neither man could simply destroy the other. So war and diplomacy began to move together. Envoys traveled repeatedly between the camps. Saladin's brother Aladil, known to the Crusaders as Saladin, played an important role in negotiations. He was calm, intelligent, and trusted by the Sultan. Richard found him easier to deal with than some other commanders. At one point, an extraordinary proposal was discussed. Richard's sister Joanna might marry Aladil. The couple would rule Jerusalem and surrounding lands, bringing the conflict to an end through a dynastic union. The plan was never realistic for long. Religious authorities, political expectations, and the intentions of the people involved stood in the way. Joanna herself strongly objected to marrying a Muslim ruler. Still, the proposal reveals how flexible medieval diplomacy could become. The same leaders who fought under sacred banners could imagine solving the struggle through marriage and shared rule. Richard also requested gifts and exchanged courtesies. When he became ill, Saladin sent fruit, ice, or medical assistance according to accounts that vary in detail. Such gestures were not friendship in the modern sense. They belonged to diplomatic custom and the culture of elite generosity. But they helped create the later image of two noble rivals. Beneath the courtesies, both men remained determined. Late in 1191, Richard's army advanced toward Jerusalem. The weather had changed. Rain fell. Roads became muddy. Tents and clothing remained wet. Cold winds crossed the hills. Supplies moved slowly from the coast. Saladin watched the approach and strengthened the city. The Crusaders reached Beit Nuba within a day or two of Jerusalem. Some may have seen the hills surrounding the holy city in the distance. Pilgrims who had crossed Europe imagined entering the places they had come to recover. Yet the commanders understood the danger. Even if the walls fell, Saladin's army could cut the route to Jaffa. The Crusaders might find themselves trapped in an inland city without enough food. A council decided to withdraw. For ordinary soldiers, the decision was bitter. They had endured disease, battle, heat, and winter storms. Jerusalem seemed almost within reach. Now they turned back toward the coast. Saladin's relief was immense, though he could not know whether the withdrawal was permanent. The next months brought political confusion among the Crusaders. The question of who should rule the surviving kingdom remained unresolved. Guy of Lusignan had lost support. Conrad of Montferrat controlled Tyre and had proven his ability. Richard and Philip favored different factions. Conrad was eventually recognized as king, but before he could be crowned, he was assassinated in Tyre in April 1192 by members of the Nizari Ismailis. Rumors immediately spread. Some accused Richard. Others suspected Saladin or rival nobles. No final answer can be proven. The murder demonstrated once again how quickly power could change through a blade in a narrow street. Henry of Champagne soon married Isabella, the heiress connected to the kingdom's crown, and became its leading ruler. Guy received Cyprus, where his descendants would establish another Latin kingdom. Richard continued operations along the southern coast. He captured Durham and again considered an advance toward Jerusalem. In June 1192, the army moved inland a second time and reached Beit Nuba once more. Again, debate divided the leaders. Some wanted to attack Jerusalem immediately. Others proposed moving south toward Cairo or threatening Egypt, believing that Saladin could not hold Jerusalem if his wealthiest province were endangered. Richard understood that capturing a sacred city was not enough. It had to be supplied and defended after the crusading army returned to Europe. Scouts and local guides reported that Saladin had damaged wells, removed supplies, and prepared defenses. The season was hot. Water remained uncertain. The Crusader army had not been destroyed, but its unity was weakening. Richard abandoned the advance again. According to one famous story, when someone tried to show him Jerusalem from a hill, he covered his face with his shield and refused to look at a city he could not deliver. The story may have been shaped by later admiration, but it captures the disappointment of the moment. Saladin had preserved Jerusalem without fighting another Hattin. Yet his own position was fragile. Years of campaigning had exhausted the treasury. Emirs wanted to return to their lands. Family members had their own ambitions. Some commanders questioned decisions. The Sultan's health was not always strong. He could not assume that time favored him forever. Then, in July 1192, Saladin moved against Jaffa. Richard was at Acre when the attack began. Saladin's forces broke into the city after fierce fighting, though defenders held the citadel. The capture threatened the Crusader coastal system and offered Saladin a chance to reverse the momentum of the previous year. News reached Richard by sea. He responded with speed. A small fleet sailed south. As the ships approached Jaffa, Richard learned that the citadel still held. He brought his vessel close to shore and leaped into the shallow water with a relatively small force. The sudden landing surprised Saladin's troops. Fighting spread through the streets and along the beach. Richard's men recaptured the city. Saladin regrouped and returned several days later, hoping to overwhelm the small crusader force before reinforcements arrived. Richard organized a defensive position outside Jaffa, using spearmen, crossbowmen, and a limited number of mounted knights. The Muslim cavalry attacked repeatedly. Richard fought among his men and led counterattacks. Accounts from both sides emphasized his personal courage. Saladin's troops could not break the position, and the assault ended. The Battle of Jaffa was one of Richard's most remarkable achievements. But it did not change the larger truth. Neither side could win complete victory. Richard could not take Jerusalem securely. Saladin could not remove the Crusaders from the coast. Both leaders were tired. Both had political problems beyond the battlefield. Both understood that continued war might destroy gains already made. Negotiations became urgent. In September 1192, the Treaty of Jaffa brought the Third Crusade to an end. The agreement left the Crusaders in control of a narrow coastal strip from Tyre to Jaffa, though boundaries and specific places remained complicated. Ascalon's fortifications were to remain demolished. Saladin retained Jerusalem and most of the interior. Christian pilgrims were permitted to visit the holy city and worship at their sacred sites. The treaty was not the victory either side had imagined. Europe had sent kings, fleets, and armies, but Jerusalem remained under Muslim rule. Saladin had kept the city, but Acre and much of the coast were again in Crusader hands. The political presence created by the First Crusade survived. Yet peace, even temporary peace, brought relief. Pilgrims traveled toward Jerusalem. Prisoners returned. Soldiers prepared to go home. Ships were loaded. Markets reopened along roads that had known years of armies. Richard sailed from the eastern Mediterranean in October 1192. He and Saladin never saw one another. The Lionheart disappeared westward across the sea. Saladin turned back toward Damascus. The great contest was over. After years spent beneath banners and inside military camps, Saladin returned to Damascus. The city welcomed him with the familiar sound of water moving through gardens and courtyards. The Barada River still fed channels that crossed the plain. Markets opened. Beneath covered streets. The Umayyad Mosque stood at the center of public life, its stone walls carrying memories of centuries. Saladin was no longer the young man who had once studied there. He was in his mid-50s, an advanced age for a ruler who had endured repeated campaigns, illness, long journeys, and constant responsibility. His empire stretched across Egypt, Syria, parts of northern Mesopotamia, the Hijaz, and Yemen through a network of relatives and governors. Jerusalem remained under his authority. His name was known from Baghdad to London, but the man who returned from the Third Crusade was tired. He still received officials and dealt with matters of state. He heard petitions. He met family members and commanders. He considered the future of the lands he had assembled. Yet there was little time to create a stable plan for succession. Saladin had many sons. He had also given major territories to brothers, nephews, and other relatives. His eldest son Al-Athil was associated with Damascus. Another son, Al-Aziz, held Egypt. Al-Zahir governed Aleppo. His brother Al-Adil remained one of the most capable men in the family. Each possessed followers and interests. Saladin's authority had kept the system together. Without him, rivalry would be difficult to avoid. In February 1193, after returning from welcoming pilgrims, Saladin fell ill with a fever. Doctors attended him. Members of the court waited for news. Religious recitation continued near his room. At moments, he seemed to improve. Then his strength faded. The ruler who had survived assassins, Montgessard, Hattin, and years of war could not defeat illness. Saladin died in Damascus on March 4, 1193. He was about 55 years old. Contemporary admirers wrote that grief spread through the city. People gathered in streets and near the citadel. The death of a ruler was not only a personal loss. It created uncertainty. Soldiers wondered who would pay them. Officials wondered who would remain in office. Families wondered whether war would return. Saladin was buried in Damascus near the Umayyad Mosque. Later generations would visit his tomb. The building was repaired and changed over time, but the location remained connected to his memory. He rested in the city he had loved, far from the fortress of Tikrit where his life began. Writers emphasized that he left little personal wealth. One account stated that his treasury did not contain enough gold and silver to pay for a grand royal funeral. The exact figures may have been selected to teach a moral lesson, but they fit his reputation for giving money away. He had ruled one of the wealthiest states of the age, yet did not leave behind a legendary private hoard. His empire soon divided. Al-Afdal inherited Damascus. Al-Aziz held Egypt. Al-Zahir remained in Aleppo. Rivalries emerged, and their uncle Al-Adil gradually became the strongest member of the family. By the end of the decade, Al-Adil had taken control of much of the Ayyubid state. The dynasty survived, but the unity of Saladin's personal rule never returned in exactly the same form. Ayyubid princes governed Egypt, Syria, and neighboring regions for decades. They fought one another at times and cooperated at others. They negotiated with later Crusades, built fortifications, supported schools, and participated in the trade networks of the Eastern Mediterranean and Red Sea. In Egypt, the Ayyubid order eventually gave way to the Mamluks in the middle of the 13th century. In Syria, Mongol invasions transformed the political world. Jerusalem changed hands more than once. Saladin's victory did not end the Crusades. It did not create permanent unity. It did not bring peace to the region. But it altered the balance of power and gave later generations a story larger than the boundaries of his state. Muslim chroniclers close to Saladin helped shape his memory. Baha al-Din ibn Shaddad, a judge and scholar who knew him personally, wrote a biography filled with admiration. He described Saladin's religious devotion, generosity, patience, and conduct in war. Imad al-Din al-Isfahani, a talented secretary, wrote in an elaborate literary style and celebrated the victories of the court. Ibn al-Athir, another major historian, offered a more critical perspective at times, especially regarding Saladin's relationship with the legacy of Nur al-Din. These writers did not produce modern neutral biographies. They had loyalties, purposes, and literary traditions. Yet their works preserve details of court life, campaigns, negotiations, fears, and personal habits. Through them, we glimpse Saladin listening to the recitation of the Quran. We see him moved to tears by stories of suffering. We see him sitting with scholars, forgiving some petitioners, rewarding messengers, and worrying about the discipline of his army. We also see a ruler who pursued power relentlessly. He displaced rivals. He placed relatives in command. He used war to build a dynasty. He ordered punishments and executions. He raised taxes and demanded military service. His achievement cannot be understood if he is turned into a gentle figure outside his own age. Saladin was admired partly because he combined qualities that rarely remain together in memory. He was a conqueror who sometimes preferred negotiation. He was a ruler of immense territories who gave away much of his personal wealth. He could show mercy after Jerusalem and severity after Hattin. He fought a religious war while making practical alliances and treaties across religious lines. He became a symbol of unity, yet much of his life was spent fighting other Muslim rulers to create that unity. The contradictions are not flaws in the story. They are the story. In Western Europe, Saladin's image also changed. At first, he was the terrifying enemy who had captured Jerusalem and defeated the true cross. His name appeared in sermons, chronicles, and calls for crusade. Taxes were raised in England and France to fund the response. Parents and preachers used his victory as a sign of Christian failure and divine judgment. But admiration slowly entered the tradition. Stories of his courtesy toward prisoners, his treatment of Jerusalem, and his exchanges with Richard circulated widely. Medieval romances transformed him into a model of generosity and noble behavior, even while presenting him as a religious opponent. Some legends invented family connections to Europe or imagined secret admiration for Christianity. These tales tell us more about European ideals than about the historical Saladin. Centuries later, literature strengthened the legend. Dante placed Saladin among virtuous non-Christians in the first circle of the Inferno, separate from the deeper punishments of hell. In the modern period, Sir Walter Scott's novel The Talisman presented Saladin as wise, controlled, and almost mysterious beside a proud Richard the Lionheart. Paintings, Plays, novels, films, and political speeches continued to reshape him. In Europe, he became an example of the honorable enemy. In the Middle East, especially in the modern era, he became a symbol of unity and resistance to foreign occupation. Leaders invoked his name. Statues were raised. His Kurdish origins, his rule of Egypt and Syria, and his recovery of Jerusalem allowed many communities to claim part of his legacy. Yet symbols simplify. The real Saladin lived in a world that does not fit modern national boundaries. He was born in what is now Iraq to a Kurdish family with roots farther north. He rose in a Turkish-led military order in Syria. He ruled largely Arabic-speaking lands. His soldiers and officials came from many regions and backgrounds. His political language belonged to Islam and to the universal claims of medieval rulership, not to a modern nation-state. To understand him, we must return to that world. We must remember the long roads between Cairo and Damascus, the mountain fortresses of Syria, the ships entering Acre, the dry plain around Hattin, the crowded streets of Jerusalem, the palace offices where scribes recorded grain and silver, the tents where rulers received envoys by lamplight. We must also remember the people whose names rarely entered chronicles, farmers who saw armies cross their fields, sailors who carried horses through storms, prisoners waiting to learn whether ransom would arrive, families leaving Jerusalem with whatever they could carry, Muslim inhabitants returning to holy places after generations of Crusader rule, Eastern Christians adjusting once again to a new government, Jewish families rebuilding a community in the city, soldiers from distant villages who followed a banner and never returned home. Their lives formed the ground beneath the legend. Saladin's greatest military victory at Hattin was not a miracle produced in a single morning. It came after nearly 2 decades of administration, diplomacy, family alliances, failed campaigns, patient rebuilding, and the gradual union of Egypt and Syria. His capture of Jerusalem was not simply the result of courage. It followed the destruction of the kingdom's field army, the rapid surrender of surrounding cities, and careful negotiation at the walls. His survival against Richard was not a perfect victory. It depended on distance, supply, weather, damaged wells, political divisions among the Crusaders, and the exhaustion of his own coalition. History often remembers moments, but moments are built by years. The boy Yusuf did not know that his life would lead to Jerusalem. He did not begin with a crown, a prophecy, or an army. He began within a family forced to leave one town and seek service in another. He learned under stronger men. He followed his uncle into Egypt reluctantly. He inherited power unexpectedly. He lost battles. He made compromises. He waited. And when the moment came, he was prepared. Perhaps that is why his story endured. Not because he was invincible. He was defeated at Montcassard. He failed at Tyre. He lost Acre. He could not drive Richard's army into the sea. Not because he was always merciful. He lived by the severe customs of medieval war and made decisions that brought death, captivity, and suffering. Not because the empire he created lasted unchanged. It divided almost immediately after his death. His story endured because he transformed a scattered inheritance into power, turned a long political struggle into a decisive victory, and entered Jerusalem without repeating the scale of slaughter that had marked its earlier conquest. He became remembered not only for taking a city, but for the manner in which he chose to take it. Even that memory should be held carefully, with space for those who paid ransom, lost homes, or entered captivity. Mercy in the medieval world was often incomplete. Yet incomplete mercy could still change the meaning of a conquest. As evening settles over Damascus, the old city grows quieter. The crowds thin around the markets. Lamps glow behind wooden screens. Water continues to move through channels beneath the sound of distant footsteps. Near the Umayyad Mosque stands the resting place of the man once called Yusuf ibn Ayyub. Empires have risen and fallen since he was buried there. The Ayyubids vanished. The Mamluks came. Mongol armies crossed Syria. Ottoman sultans ruled Damascus for centuries. European powers redrew borders. Modern cities spread far beyond medieval walls. But the name remained. Saladin. A name carried through Arabic chronicles, Latin histories, Kurdish memory, European romance, sermons, poems, novels, and films. A name associated with Hattin, Jerusalem, and Richard the Lionheart. Behind that name was a human life shaped by uncertainty. A child leaving Tikrit, a student in Damascus, a reluctant officer riding into Egypt, a vizier surrounded by rivals, a sultan building unity through patience and force, a victor standing before Jerusalem, an aging commander watching the sails of the Third Crusade appear on the horizon, and finally, a tired man returning to the gardens of Damascus. The battles ended. The messengers stopped arriving. The banners were folded. The horses rested. And the ruler who had spent his life crossing deserts, rivers, mountains, and kingdoms came at last to stillness. History remembers the victory. It remembers the golden dome beneath a new banner, the dry hills of Hattin, and the two great rivals who never met. But perhaps the deeper story is quieter. Power passes. Cities remain. And every legend begins as an ordinary life moving, one uncertain step at a time, toward a future no one can yet see.